Welcome to the Biometric Update podcast. I'm your host, Joel McConvey. Today, Biometric Update's editor-in-chief, Chris Burt, has a conversation with some folks from the No Phone Home campaign who are raising the alarm about identity systems that phone home for verification. They believe this constitutes a major threat to public privacy and could derail the whole project of creating an anonymous, private digital identity system that people can trust. Chris, this is a bit of a spicy conversation we have here about No Phone Home. Can you give us a quick summary of what phone home means and who's involved in this conversation?
Sure. Phone home refers to a capability that is known within the ISO IEC 18013 standard as server retrieval, and also known by the same name, certainly outside of that ISO standard. And the server retrieval capability is one in which the credential that's being used refers back to or connects to the issuer or the server owned by the issuer, and essentially checks in with that issuer. So what that means, practically speaking, is that in the case of a credit card transaction, the relying party can get assurance that the funds being transferred are present in the account of the person making the transaction, who is the credit card holder. That's the credential in this case. For identity transactions, it gets a little bit thorny, or as you say, spicy, because that call back to the server of the issuer provides the potential for the issuer to find out things about what the person holding the credential is doing. In other words, it opens the door to potential tracking or surveillance by that issuing authority. Okay. And who's out here raising the alarm about this? Who are you speaking to that has the idea that this is a dangerous road to go down? So we've got Steve McCown. We've also, I was joined by Kim Hamilton Duffy, who's best known as the Executive Director of the Decentralized Identity Foundation, or DIF. It was also joined by Timothy Ruff, who's co-founder and principal at Digital Trust Venture Partners. But all three of these individuals are very well known, certainly in their particular area of the digital identity community. And all the kind of people who have credibility and have a voice that is heard by others within the community. So it was great to hear from them. The other side is not really represented in this discussion, and I think that certainly bears noting. The conversations that I've had with people who are involved with creating the ISO standard definitely suggest a real mix of sympathy for their point and an acknowledgement that server retrieval is a potential problem and that it could be used nefariously, but also pushback. And part of their suggestion is that the concerns of the privacy community are not best addressed in the technical standard.
Okay, well, a lot to chew on here. Let's have a listen to this conversation.
I'm here today with three of the principals from the No Phone Home campaign. Joining me are Timothy Ruff, co-founder and principal at Digital Trust Venture Partners and co-inventor of Sovereign; Kim Hamilton Duffy, Executive Director of the Decentralized Identity Foundation, better known as DIF, and a MOSIP Technical Committee member; and Steve McCown, Chief Architect at Anonymy Labs and a Utah Privacy Commissioner. Thank you all, three of you, for joining me today to talk about No Phone Home.
Thank you, Chris.
My first question for you is can you just give us a quick sort of elevator pitch type version of what the phone home problem is as you see it?
Sure. This is Timothy. I'll go first. It's pretty simple. The entire self-sovereign identity movement, the word self-sovereign meant that the individual is in control of their identity, independent of any other controlling organization, whether that be a private entity or government. Doesn't matter. The whole point is that they have some independence. And when you have a digital identity system that in order to verify its validity, it has to phone home back to anybody, frankly, but usually the originally issuing institution. And the case we're worried about most is government. Because we already know that the big tech companies are surveilling us in a bunch of different ways through our devices and our location tracking and all the things that we reveal with our search habits online. And it's really, really hard to get that genie back in the bottle. But the new actor on the scene is government. They're getting into the digital identity business. And if the digital identity systems that they implement require verification by phoning home back to them, they've now created a tracking ability that they can now see everywhere you're using this identity. And if the only place you use this identity is when you're interacting back with them, it's not a problem. It's zero problem if that's the case. But they're encouraging you to use these identities everywhere and to replace usernames and passwords and to go everywhere and replace everything and use your government issued identity. And so the net effect of that is that now you are basically leaving a digital trail, digital exhaust everywhere you go, and the government is able to gather that and see that. And right now, the only promise that we're getting from them is that they promise not to do anything with that capability. They promise not to use it. They promise not to store the data. In some cases, they say, we just won't turn it on and gather it. But historically, we know that government is always just one emergency away from activating these kinds of capabilities. And so as digital identity pros, we just don't want to see the capability within such easy reach, because we think once government gets a taste of that ability to track people everywhere they go, they're not going to relinquish that capability very easily, maybe ever.
Okay, fair enough. My understanding is that this capability that you refer to, it is included in the ISO standard, which is really sort of the germ of this debate, right? But my understanding is that the standard doesn't mandate or require that this capability be used, and in fact, people who are involved in the creation of the standard, I know, would say that it is typically not implemented in this way, or that the majority of implementations of the kind that you're talking about, like for national identity programs, for instance, or state identity programs, are implemented differently. So why, that being the case, is it a problem that the capability is included in the standard?
Well, so that's a really good point. Looking at the standard itself, it's not required, this phone home capability. So there's two modes that it can operate in. One is called
Recommended though, right?
Yeah, well, one is called server retrieval, which means it does phone home. The other is device retrieval, meaning all the relevant information is contained within the credential that the user or driver in this case would have. Here in Utah, our driver's license system was implemented with server retrieval. It's since been turned off and all the logs deleted. But the reason it was implemented that way was because that is what's recommended in the standard. It actually says the word recommended. Another issue, so there's that first issue with the individual's own driver's license being a phone home or not. But then when it comes to the verification terminals, they need to support both modes. And so what happens is a verification terminal in a state can phone home to another state or country and report on driver's license usage from that jurisdiction. And so there's kind of two questions here. The first one is, do we want our state to report on us? And then the next question is, do we want our state to phone home to other jurisdictions and report on visitors to our state.
Fair enough. Kim or Timothy, would you like to add on?
Yeah, I have a couple of follow-ups to that. So implementers there's different components of the ISO spec. And there's the MDL reader, which is one of the main points we're talking about. So MDL readers it's not required, it's recommended. So what does that mean? In practice, implementers are incentivized to implement that, because otherwise they will likely get rejected during procurement and things like that. So based on my discussions with implementers, and then also what is available on open source, easily able to verify these exist. So implementers are incentivized to implement full spec. And so that's what we happen, which means that this switch is on, so that if an issuer just changes their mind and starts to include server retrieval tokens, this code path is there ready to light up. Now, the other part that's concerning is, so Steve mentioned Utah's implementation, and so what did that mean? In fact, the implementation was preferring server retrieval because it was more efficient than Bluetooth retrieval. So that came as a surprise in this IIW session, that for purposes of just technical efficiency, this server retrieval mode was the mode that was being used in practice. And so my point is that we need to be very intentional about these decisions.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you for clarifying how a capability that's not required in the standard makes its way into practice, or at least one click of a button away from being implemented, right? At the same time, one of the questions that this debate has raised for me is, if an issuer can't be trusted to be forthright about a policy change like activating server retrieval, and would do it surreptitiously, then how would a change to the standard, or making server retrieval non-compliant with the ISO standard, protect users from being tracked by that issuer? In other words, is this not a sort of a trust issue that we would be kind of papering over with a technical specification?
That's a really good way to put it, actually, because the phone home statement isn't an MDL statement. We're talking about, it's not an ISO 18013 statement. It's a phone home statement. And the phone home statement, if you look at the words, we were very careful that we didn't want the authority, which is usually government in this case, tracking identity system users however they might do it. So this, just taking one particular standard that people are talking about a lot and making one change to it, does not make everything all better. It's not a solved problem. In fact, there are some popular protocols. The big one I'll go ahead and name is OpenID Connect, that are very popular. And these protocols only work by phoning home, and they shouldn't get a free pass. I mean, that's all they do is phone home. Now, in a situation, and let's be clear, phoning home is not inherently bad. We need to say this. It's how it's applied. So let's say that you are an employee logging into your employer's system to work for the day remotely, and it phones home to verify your login. That is zero problem. That's an intra-domain application. That's frankly what the phone home capabilities were designed for, and they're completely harmless when they're used as intended. But as soon as you take that same protocol and you want to use it cross-domain instead of intra-domain, and you want to say, okay, now the person that has their government ID is going to use it to prove they're old enough to buy some alcohol somewhere, They're not just logging back into the state to access their state records. They're actually using it out somewhere and making a purchase. That's now cross-domain, and now they have the ability to track. Well, in one case, it's harmless, and the other place, it's surveillance and really dangerous in our view. And so and that's really a description of the OpenID Connect conundrum, because it's really good in one sense and helpful and harmless, and all of a sudden becomes this draconian thing that I will oppose till my dying breath when you use it in the wrong sense. And I'm using some hyperbole, but we feel very passionately, because we think that once this capability is implemented and in use, it's going to be addictive and hard to ever remove. And so we think we have to stop it now. We have to kill it in the crib. Sorry for the macabre, metaphor there, but we've got to start it very early.
Well, and it's an interesting choice of metaphor too. In that, as you were describing that, Timothy, it seemed to me that maybe we arrived at this point through an iterative process where we were using technology and OpenID Connect, for instance, for a certain set of use cases, and then as those use cases are expanding or changing or evolving, the problem is arising. Is that a fair way to describe that?
Yes, and I think that actually, and I'm sorry, I don't mean to dominate. We're also passionate about this, and I'm a terrible interrupter. So, but I'm very passionate about that. The people who are implementing these things, I don't think they're evil. I think they have good intentions, and I think it exactly happened the way that you said. I think that they have a bunch of use cases, and those use cases are expanding as digital transformation continues, and then they start to apply the tools that they know and are comfortable with to other use cases. But it's then up to us as an identity and really privacy advocates to say, wait a second, the line stops here, because these use cases are out of bounds, and all of a sudden good becomes bad when you cross this line. And that's really all we're saying. And we're not impugning the motives. We're not impugning the MDL. It's a great concept. And even the standard itself, it's one standard that has this one capability, apparently inserted by one country who really wanted it. And some cultures are totally fine with this kind of surveillance. And so taking that capability out of the standard might upset a couple of countries and harm its adoption and interoperability. In that sense, it's probably not going to cause much of a ripple for most of the space, but it won't solve the problem of other vendors coming in and doing exactly what you said and bringing OpenID Connect, which phones home for everything, and saying, well, we're not using server retrieval, but yet we're going to phone home on every single verification. So the objection we have is on tracking and surveillance in any form, and it's not specifically about the MDL or the ISO standard.
Yeah, one thing I'd like to point out, when we presented this at the Internet Identity Workshop last April, a couple of attendees that were in the session were from the American Association of Motor Vehicle Administrators, AMVA. And I would like to call them out. So there was some initial pushback. It was an impassioned discussion, but within a couple of weeks of that meeting, they changed their recommendations. And they're now disallowing server retrieval for use within the United States. Now, AMVA is directly related to the United States, so each country can choose their own path. Mm-hmm. But I would like to give them some kudos for hearing our complaint about server retrieval and phoning home and being more proactive than I'd ever seen an industry organization be. And so, like I say, I found out about it about 30 days later, and then it was an official standard that's been released on their site. And so states are in the process of making these changes so that they can make it more private, including Utah. Nobody had any nefarious intent behind setting it up this way. And when it was brought to their attention, they quickly made the changes. So people have been very receptive to this. we're not seeing lots and lots of pushback. Really, it's more of just an awakening, if you want to look at it that way.
One thing about use of identity standards and protocols in increasing context, sort of beyond what they were originally designed for, that's the part that has made the mobile driver's license spec especially interesting for me as I look at it. I think that when you look at it in the context of, if you live in the United States, so not just server retrieval, all of the additional sort of privacy sorts of risks that are introduced. Here's what happens at a high level. The ISO spec calls out, here's a list of potential harms and privacy related, et cetera. Those are in Appendix E. So, and you could see ISO's perspective that their role is not to set up the privacy policies of implementers. But so ISO has this Appendix E, they're done, move on. So then AMVA then has their recommendations, which apply to say, United States issued driver's licenses. Mm-hmm. But in this one case, AMVA did do a great thing and say, we're banning server retrieval from implementations. So, but in general, the rest of AMVA's recommendations are just calling out risks. So then they rely on the states to do things in action. So the concern that I have is that there's these network hops, right? And so everyone, along the way is calling out risks, but the implementers aren't sufficiently clear what those are. And that's what happened in the Utah context, right? Because both the ISO spec and the guidelines did call out these risks of server retrieval. They called out other risks around, sort of correlation that's possible on the transaction logs and making sure that those aren't, sort of sent back for later correlation, potential risks on the MDL reader logs, things like that. But so I've reached the conclusion that for Americans, this spec is a leaky boat, and we have Scotch tape with which to patch it, right? So server retrieval, I agree, that is great that they've moved ahead, but I think where we're talking past each other in other, other people who are very strong supporters of it, I think a lot of it is just different perspective. They're protected by, say, General Data Protection Framework or something like that. We have nothing. Now, here's the other part that makes it even more fun. We use driver's licenses in ways that they could never dream of. So the way that I use my driver's license, I was thinking about it last week. It's like, I think that I've been fortunate not to get pulled over by law enforcement for a long time. The only time I think I use my driver's license is to actually get it renewed. What I do use it for is picking up subscriptions,
Sure.
If I enter a bar, checking into a hotel, or, so all of these things, sort of more mundane things where, in the US, this driver's license serves their de facto national identity card. So all of these things, sorry, I'm on a bit of a rabbit hole with it, but I've just been thinking a lot about the American context and how it's different for us. And so I think what we're saying is this is just opening up entirely new avenues for tracking some of, our highest stakes identity data. And just by luck of, how you say, the fact that we're all walking around with these legacy plastic, in some cases people are scanning it, but that's very rare. For the most part, people are looking at it, making no record of it, and moving on. So we need to be very intentional about it. It is a matter of sovereignty and depending on where you live. And I think that it's been really kind of surprising to think about how sort of naive people have been when thinking about its use in the American context, because we use it so much more and we don't have the data protections that others do.
Yeah, there's a couple of interesting points there that I'd like to pick up on. Kim, you refer to using a Scotch tape kind of fix, on the leaky boat, as you say, and in this case, the Scotch tape would be the AMVA requirement, right? Not to use server retrieval. So. Is, I guess, the part one of this question, just to avoid going on a lengthy tangent, would then say GDPR be that same Scotch tape maybe for Europe, or different privacy regulations in different places?
Actually, so what I'm saying is, like, in the U.S. context, our data protections are so fragmented or non-existent. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that in different jurisdictions, they may look at this spec and say it's fine because I'm protected by concerns about MDL readers for this, that, or the other data protection guarantee that I have. And but in the United States, we don't have that luxury because we don't have any sort of comprehensive data protection. So do you see what I'm saying? It depends on the jurisdiction, and that's the nuance that I feel has not gotten sufficient attention yet.
No, that's fair enough. But Kim, it sounds then like the fix that Scotch tape in the case of the United States, because that's what's available, but maybe it's something a little more solid, a little more dependable, maybe something a little more fit for purpose that's being used to plug that leak, so to speak, in other jurisdictions. Is that a kind of
And I need to, we've been using the leaky boat metaphor a lot. It's useful in a lot of contexts here. So I need to deep dive on boat repair terminology to see like how a GDPR framework, in the relative better protection. So I think the nuance that the dimension that we're talking about is sort of enforceability, sort of what it's like. If jurisdictions will have different privacy guarantees, some better than others, but a dimension that is really important is sort of, how enforceable it is. So, yeah.
Another thing just to follow on to that, part of what we've been calling this is security by policy. And for any of the listeners who either follow politics or are annoyed by them, either one.
Those are two big buckets.
Yeah. The thing to consider is how fast does policy change? And it can change in a crisis. It can change when one administration leaves and the other comes in. There's a number of ways that this can change. And so our concern, and our initial concern with the mobile driver's license was the specification facilitates security by policy and rapid change. And so that was part of the other pushback, was that if there was a technical barrier in addition to a policy barrier, that would be better for everyone's privacy.
Okay, well, and that very much draws a line between the policy and the technical architecture sides, that actually kind of addresses the next question that I was going to ask. So I guess my final question for the three of you, then we can recognize what the issue is and how it's a little bit different depending on where you are, but the standard authors who I've been in touch with have made clear that they are hoping for more engagement as the process moves along and so on. So what should those standard authors do? What would you recommend they do to change the standard in order to address this problem?
If I can address a fundamental tension that exists in all standards bodies, and this does not impugn this group, and that tension is, I shouldn't say all standards bodies, all standards that are working in the digital identity space, and that tension is between privacy, security, and interoperability. They are a failed standard if they don't produce an interoperable thing that gets adopted. That's what a failed standard is. It's something nobody uses. So they are judged by how interoperable and how much adoption they get. So that is the overarching goal. And then everything else is a compromise along that way. It's like the privacy people come in and say, this isn't good enough. And they duke it out until they get enough, consensus to reach the final consensus. Same thing with security. Some will say it's not good enough, and others will say it's more than enough. Here's the problem. We think that inherent priority of interoperability being the highest value is what got us into this position in the first place, where the escalating use cases, which were intra-domain and then started to move into inter-domain use cases, the privacy issue was not the highest priority. It was adoption of the thing. So when you look at it from the perspective of the state of Utah, or any state, their goal, yes, they want it to be interoperable, but that's not their highest value. Their highest value is privacy and security. They have a tie for first place. They have to have security. They have to have privacy. One isn't ahead of the other. But interoperability is a secondary value to the state of Utah. So Utah is willing to say, you know what? If our state has a secure and private digital identity system that works for our citizens, and we have to sacrifice interoperability when they travel elsewhere or when people come here, then we're willing to make that sacrifice. But a standards body can't make that sacrifice because it becomes a failed standard. So there's just a different set of priorities. So I don't think I can advise any standards body to say, you should prioritize privacy ahead of interoperability, because that'll never change. They always have to have interoperability as their final goal. But I would say that they work with states like Utah and people that are maybe a little bit stronger on privacy than those people involved in reaching that consensus have been. Because there was feedback. If the one criticism I would offer to the group, and once again, all good people, and they've been very communicative and very professional, 99%. 97% maybe. But my one little piece of feedback would be, we were complaining for a long time. The reason we had to do the no phone home thing is because we didn't feel heard. We felt dismissed. We bring up these concerns. We would do it privately. We would do it publicly in social media. And they were dismissive of the concerns. And so they really left us with no choice but to band together and create a bigger scene than should have ever been necessary. It really shouldn't have been necessary, but it became necessary because we were dismissed. So that's one criticism in answer to your question that I would offer.
Yeah, another thing that I would offer on to follow on to that is when systems builders, when standards creators get together, they create whatever wonderful standard and system they have. And they focus on how does this work well and how can this benefit people? And that's an excellent focus. There was a point in my career where I did a lot of red team research on the security side. And it changed my mindset from not how will this system work well, but how could it fail or how could it be misused? How could it be used in conjunction with other systems? And that's a recommendation that I would give, is to not just work on how your system or standard will achieve its goals, but how could someone in a more adversarial sense co-opt it and make it do something different. And as we focus on how could a system or a standard be misused, we will uncover these things early on in the development process before they start being embodied in hardware and software systems and deployed.
Yeah, I'll try to keep mine brief. So in general, with ISO proceedings, there are concerns about transparency and inability to access like things like why were certain decisions made, things like that. I don't think we're going to get that to change, although I would argue that for standards applying to digital identity, we absolutely need to set a higher bar. We need to know why certain decisions are being made. But certainly we need to allow for healthy civic engagement and discussion. And so that's one reason that I've been disheartened by the response. And so I think even sort of the vanguards of SSI people have been saying things like, we're harming the industry by, doing this no phone home thing. I think that rolling the spec out in the state will harm adoption, because people will find out what it's doing. Some cybersecurity expert will, attach some network listening device, and there will be a huge uproar, which would have happened if the CEIF hadn't raised more awareness. So I think that we do need a much higher bar. We need to allow public discussion of this, and we need to allow that to happen in the context of where it's being deployed. Certain issues like, what sort of privacy reviews did happen. I think that, we'd like more information about what was done, so that we can then engage with that and understand what is, what other concerns apply. We're trying to write a lot more about, these specific concerns, which have, as Timothy has talked about, have been discussed, written about over many, many years, but only now are getting attention due to the high-profile nature of No Phone Home.
Very good. Well, I want to thank all three of you, Kim, Timothy, and Steve, for joining me to have part of this public discussion and to delve into these important issues. And we'll be continuing to track them on Biometric Update, and so I'm sure we will be in touch.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
You can read the full No Phone Home statement at nophonehome.com and read more about digital identity at www.biometricupdate.com. Thanks again for listening.